I've lived through the heyday of a science known as cybernetics. It started in the 1940s, had immense influence during the 1950s and 60s, only to suffer an eclipse from the 1980s onwards. I should point out that I've never promoted myself as a cyberneticist per se, although I now see in retrospect that it's a science that has had a profound influence on my work as an architect and designer, and more recently on my newfound involvement in visual music. So what is cybernetics, and why do I think that its values and methods have relevance today? As a start, I need to remind you how and why cybernetics was invented in the first place. Cybernetics was the answer to the question, how do you fire a missile at a moving target? In 1942, the answer wasn't known, which led Norbert Wiener, an MIT mathematics professor, being charged with a complex problem concerning the accuracy of anti-aircraft artillery. Wiener was a brilliant mathematician, but he couldn't solve the artillery problem without help from a disparate group of his fellow professors at MIT, all of them with highly specialized scientific skills. And together, as a team, they were able to put forward new theories of prediction to arrive at a solution to a very tricky problem. It was a success that got them all thinking. They realized that they had needed to take a completely new approach to engineering design to produce a result that had turned what had been regarded previously as a hit-and-miss art into an exact statistical science. All of which made Wiener and his colleagues realize that there was a whole region of similar design problems that could be tackled by methods involving the calculus of variation. They decided to call this new field of control and communication cybernetics, from the Greek for steersman. At an inaugural meeting to discuss their new science, held in Princeton in 1944, it became clear to the engineers, physiologists, mathematicians, and philosophers present that there was a common basis of ideas linking their various disciplines, and that some attempt should be made to achieve a shared vocabulary. You'll see from this list of some of the attendees that the subject of cybernetics captured the attention of the sharpest minds in the USA. Similar meetings were held at regular intervals and became known as the Macy meetings, after Josiah Macy, who financed them. Norbert Wiener's work on the predictive mechanisms of missiles had led him to realize that the concept of feedback was endemic to any complex additive system of control. The circular processes of feedback are as applicable to the steering of a ship to keep it on course as they are to a human hand or finger, which involves a system with a large number of joints. It was the ramifications of feedback, both in engineering design and in biology, that became the focus of Wiener's famous book, Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and Machine. The title in itself defined the science of cybernetics. In his book, Wiener explains that control can't be exercised by a simple single feedback, a fact that he illustrates with reference to the way we steer a car on an icy road. This is an example of control by information feedback. It's a process that we all take for granted in living our lives. But it took the discoveries of Wiener and his colleagues to forge from such self-evident facts a complicated theory which exerted huge impact during the central decades of the last century. Wiener, in his definition of the new science, had assumed it was just that, a science. But in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, it was quickly realized that the system of producing art could equally well be described as cybernetic, even though, in this case, it might involve the skill and actions of only one person. It's by having a continuous conversation with himself that an artist applies a cybernetic process to what he's doing, even though he might not be fully conscious of the fact when it's happening. Ranulph Glanville, a second-generation UK cyberneticist, explains this idea very eloquently. You can read Glanville's description here, but please don't take it completely literally. His word doodling means not only pencil in hand, but also any available medium which can facilitate the mind of an artist looking from the inside in the knowledge that everything is new, a phrase I've borrowed from Carl Jung. In our contemporary world, analog tools, for instance a brush and palette, have largely been cast aside in favour of new modes of expression, but the system by which a work of art is created remains unchanged. It still follows the cybernetic process that Glanville describes. Now, I'll go a step further by explaining how a cybernetic system underpins the making of shapes, a piece of visual music that I've based on J.S. Bach's first cello suite. The 6 movements of the suite, as transcribed for clarinet, have provided me with an opportunity to explore the intrinsic relationship that exists between abstract imagery and music. I produced my visual interpretations by holding a conversation with myself. But before I explain how all that worked, I'll perform a few excerpts. For each of those excerpts, my chosen algorithms produced image sequences containing 2,000 to 3,000 frames. Then, to use Ranulph Glanville's terminology, in my role as a marker, I selected a specific set of frames which then, in my role as viewer, I chose to either accept or feed back into the system so as to eventually find images that matched both my own guiding vision and the mood and notation of my chosen music. This is a cybernetic process, the circular system of choices an artist makes in his dual roles of marker and viewer, which give him the freedom to act as an ultimate decision maker rather than as a mere artisan. So far, I've said something about cybernetics and visual music, but as I mentioned at the outset, I became involved in the subject much earlier, in the 1970s, when almost by default, I found myself straddling the worlds of cybernetics, architecture, and design. This happened because of a commission I received from the Financial Times. The intention was that the FT would lead the way in Fleet Street by introducing new electronic ways for both editing and printing the paper. It was a radical plan which involved my company, Trickett Associates, undertaking a study of the whole organisation to assess the environmental and space implications of introducing new technology into Bracken House. The FT project came into the category of exceedingly complex, according to an analysis of comparative systems prepared by the UK cyberneticist Stafford Beer. He distinguished between three classes of system: simple, complex, and exceedingly complex. And clearly, it's a list that demonstrates a wry sense of humour, with physics providing deterministic answers on the subject of billiards, and statistics giving a probabilistic account of penny tossing. Beer put only three systems in the exceedingly complex category, as the brain, the company, and the economy. Defining the way the FT could develop techniques for its survival in a changing environment presented a formidable challenge. The problem was elusive and controversial to the extent that it could best be described as a tangle. I've vivid memories of investigating the environmental, social, technological, and logistical aspects of a tangle, where at every turn expressions of considerable doubt were voiced by those whose lives would be radically changed. It was a cybernetic approach that provided the key to unravelling the tangle, a process involving a constant reiteration of correction and feedback, with people at all levels in the company. Then, at the end of a long, slippery road, we explain the options available to the FT by means of a three-dimensional space planning model. Experience of new technology was slim at that time, but I was able to incorporate tips gained during visits to the Washington Post and the Baltimore Sun in the United States, where new editing and printing methods had already been integrated. In the end, and for the best of reasons, the FT's board of directors decided that they would not be the first to take a leap into the unknown. You may remember that for Rupert Murdoch, who did take this first step at the Times, the result was 1 year of strikes at his Wapping printing facility. So, as it turned out, the FT's decision to withdraw was both shrewd and opportunistic, as was its decision to move ahead with a fallback idea to print the paper simultaneously in Frankfurt. The second project involved Trickett Associates in the complete redesign of the FT's editorial department, to include a central electronic brain for transferring editorial material to Germany. We applied all the cybernetic principles we had learned previously to achieve a result that was acclaimed some years later by the UK Press Gazette as the most comfortable newsroom in London, a model of thoughtful design. Our cybernetic approach had paid off and continued to do so ever after. But that's enough about me for the moment. The cybernetic movement in the UK was extraordinarily far-reaching. It's only recently that I've realised how this newfound knowledge entered the world of the arts. I'm indebted to Nick Lambert for this knowledge. It happened by accident when Roy Ascott was a student of Victor Passmore at Newcastle School of Art in the late 1950s. You can glance at Roy's memories of the moment of discovery here, a moment that led eventually to Roy setting up his ground course at the Ealing College of Art, which was all tied together by the idea of systems and process. Later, at Ipswich Civic College, students were introduced to cybernetics as a means of understanding what things do, how they do them, and what makes them behave that way. There was more than a touch of the shaman in Roy Ascott's teaching method, a belief that the creation of art as a cybernetic system using computers could serve to increase both its variety and vigour. He saw no reason to suppose that the art of process should be any less visual or poetic or musical than the art of object. In those early days of cybernetics, Roy Ascott was not alone in straining towards creating art as a system. Another adventurer was Gordon Pask, who described himself as a mechanic philosopher, although those who knew him regarded him with some awe as a poet, scientist, and humorist. All agreed that he possessed a rare intelligence bordering on that of a maverick genius. As a student, Pask had met Norbert Wiener at Cambridge Station and escorted him to the venue where Wiener was due to give a lecture on cybernetics. It took only that short time for Pask to decide that his life's work would lie in that direction. Gordon Pask's most substantial work was Colloquy of Mobiles. It demonstrated his genius to the extent that only now are we beginning to realise how far ahead of his time he was. Colloquy took centre stage at Cybernetic Serendipity, a gem of an exhibition held in 1968 at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, which I well remember visiting, and it left a lasting impression. Now, 50 years later, Paul Pangaro at the College of Creative Studies in Detroit has involved his students in making a replica of Colloquy. Pask's outdated analog technology has been replaced by modern digital software, but the magic of the original is retained. Here's Paul's describing the result.
And the idea behind Colloquy is to have a family of mobiles interacting on their own. Each mobile is completely independent, has its own brain, and it rotates on its axis, and some of them rotate on a bar. And serendipitously, they come to a certain moment when they start to interact. Mostly they're on their own and just doing what they're doing. But on a particular occasion, they interact. When a light from the male figure hits the mirror of the female figure by chance and reflects back to the male figure, then they stop and they start to interact. And they wait a while and they have this kind of thing going. And then after a while they calm down and then they return to their REM. It was amazing that you would have machines talking to machines 50 years ago. And it was even more amazing that there was a gender joke involved.
On both sides of the Atlantic, the cybernetic community might have been small, but its impact was huge in providing a cross-continental bridge for post-war discoveries that have formed today's digital world. Gordon Pask's life was changed forever by his brief meeting with Norbert Wiener, and earlier, Wiener had travelled to the National Physical Laboratory in the UK, where he and Alan Turing discussed the fundamental ideas that underpinned the science of cybernetics, a subject that was of close interest to Turing as a member of the Ratio Club, the UK's answer to the Macy meetings. The twin aims of cybernetics as defined by Wiener, control and communication in the animal and the machine, are reflected in Turing's own ability to move seamlessly between his two main areas of research, intelligent machinery and morphogenesis. Often, his ideas were first tested at the Ratio Club, where Turing felt he was among like minds. Here, Fellow members were receptive too, and could understand more than most his radical views on the subject of machine intelligence and on how growth and form happens in the animal. It was the intertwined intellectual skills of Turing and John von Neumann, another cybernetist, who was regular attendee at the Macy meetings in Princeton, that enabled them together to invent computer science and to define rules by which the machine of cybernetics, the computer, would eventually change all our lives forever. Given these immense achievements, I have to ask, has the science of cybernetics really had its day, never to return? I hold the view that the lessons it taught are as relevant now as they were in the last century. From the beginning, it was the science that flew the flag for transformational creativity. You may have noticed that neither the Macy meetings nor the Ratio Club gatherings included artists. They were not invited because it was assumed at the time that they had little to offer. It was only in the latter half of the last century that such attitudes began to change, as cybernetics exerted an ever-increasing influence on how artists worked and perceived themselves. They embraced with open arms the machine of cybernetics, the computer, as a tool for artistic expression, which changed not only the nature of the art they produced, but also their role as artists. This is why, within the world of the arts, a bright annulus of cybernetic light continues to shine. Does it shine on my own sphere of visual music? I'll let you be the judge of that. But from my point of view, I see visual music as a form of artistic expression that enables me to communicate ideas that are complex and often controversial. You can see the titles of various pieces here, including today's piece, Shapes. All of them have triggered ideas that have led to the preparation of papers and presentations, many given at EVA conferences, as you see here. It's a process of ideas development that is often surprising. I would never have expected Shapes, for instance, to have become the cause of my delving into the hinterland of cybernetics. But it happened, and it was visual music that acted as the behavioural trigger. I've already explained how the making of Shapes engaged me in a cybernetic process of continuous feedback, with me acting as both marker and viewer. And so far, you've heard 4 excerpts taken from 3 movements of Bach's suite. If I had time, I'd play excerpts from the other 3 movements to produce, in all, 9 sequences of abstract imagery. Instead, I'm taking a shortcut by showing you all of them amalgamated here, both the sequences you've seen and heard, and those you haven't. I'm asking the question, where has my visual communication of musical counterpoint taken me? What, if anything, have I triggered? Again, the results are surprising. What I see appearing at certain points within my image sequences are apparently coincidental similarities between specific images and the styles adopted by 9 well-known abstract artists. I find that I've created, maybe subconsciously, a series of digital simulacra of abstract works of art, 9 of them as you see here, a somewhat unexpected form of behavioural response triggered by my visual music. No doubt the response I triggered long ago from the FT journalists in a newly equipped newsroom was more profound, but it doesn't alter the fact that a cybernetic stance, combined with a close concern with change and people's reaction to it, can reap rich rewards when presented in any form of artistic expression, architectural in the case of the FT. The common factor is that an artist's or architect's aim needs to be clearly focused on gaining an engaged response from his or her audience. It's an approach to problem solving that reveals cybernetics and design as being 2 sides of the same coin. The triggering of a behavioural response becomes crucial when artists become involved in exceedingly complex systems. If Stafford Beer were to be alive today, I'm sure he would classify climate change as just this, every bit as complex as the brain, the company, and the economy. This is why I'm calling for a cybernetic renaissance, where, as in those days immediately after the Second World War, the sharpest minds from all walks of life are brought together to face up to the most exceedingly complex system of all. Only this time, artists must play their full part in producing a positive and undeniable behavioural trigger.